Welcome students of BA Part 2 English Literature. We will continue with Paper 1, Section A, and today we are going to study another British poet, the very famous William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, in his poem The World is Too Much with Us, feels sorry for the materialistic interests of the English during his time. So people during this time were after money and had no sense of appreciation for nature, its beauty and grandeur. So Wordsworth presents in this poem his discontent over this loss of interest in the nature, and he claims that the materialistic approach of mankind has transformed human beings into senseless individuals, and further adds that humanity does not realize their loss as they are obsessed with money, power, and possessions and fail to perceive the beauty in nature which surrounds them. And the major themes of the poem are thus loss of this perception about the beauty of nature amid the busy life. And therefore, Wordsworth in this poem denounces materialism around him. William Wordsworth, born on 7th April 1770 in Cumberland, in England, was brought up in an atmosphere which had the ideals such as equality, fraternity, brotherhood. And so he grew up in this free atmosphere, and therefore he was not able to tolerate, as he grew up, the rigidity that he found in the poetry that preceded him. He was an English romantic poet who, along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, helped to launch the Romantic age in English literature with their joint publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. And Wordsworth, because of his great work, was also declared as Poet Laureate from 1843 until his death in 1850. So, students, in our earlier classes, when we read about Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard and some of the poems of William Blake, and we had talked about this period of the transitional phase from the age of reason to the romantic age. So, as we had been talking about how these poets drifted from the rigidity of meter, rhyme, and subject and moved towards little relaxation and concentration on subjects of nature rather than just town and city life. So, with William Wordsworth, we enter into that phase about which we have been talking about, that is the Romantic era. So, what are the background to the shift from the age of reason to the Romantic era? So, in England of the 18th century, Alexander Pope, he had established his poetic school called the Neoclassical movement. And this was this phase when focus was basically on reason, logic, and intellect, and feelings, emotions, or instinct and imagination, they were not given priority. And it was not considered a good poetry if they focused upon feelings, emotions, or imagination. So this school of poetry was quite popular in England and for about a century until the poets which we have been reading, that is the pre-romantic poets, they came and they started writing about the beauty of nature. And because the 18th century poetry basically focused upon the town and it avoided references to nature or nature's role in human life. So, students, why William Wordsworth is very important when we study about the Romantic era or the Romantic period? Because, along with Coleridge, it was William Wordsworth who had finally established full-fledged Romantic era because of their focus on certain characteristics in poetry and the way they looked at the world, which defined the whole era as the Romantic era. And the publication of lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Coleridge, uh, the theory of poetry was set down by the two poets. And here Wordsworth focused his attention upon the subject and style of poetry, both matter and manner. And according to Wordsworth, he defined all good poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And he emphasized upon poetry being gushing forth of the feelings from the heart and an expression of the emotions felt by the poet, just in contrast to what the 18th century ideals were set. And he rallied for a common speech within poems and argued against the poetic biases of the period and wrote some of the most influential poetry in Western literature, including his most famous work, The Prelude, which is often considered to be the crowning achievement of English Romanticism. So, what is the beginning of this term called Romanticism or this era Romanticism? So, as I have just talked about William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor's publication of lyrical ballads, so the publication of this poetry is considered as the manifesto of the Romantic movement. And with this, there is the end of the formal poetic diction of the 18th century and the beginning of more passionate and imaginative poetry of the heart. And the volume of lyrical ballads, it contains poems by Coleridge, such as Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, which helped Romanticism take hold in English poetry. So, Wordsworth's poetry basically concentrates on the ways in which he responded and related to the world. And he used his poetry to look at the relationship between nature and human life and to explore the belief that nature can have an impact on our emotional and spiritual lives. And as I had mentioned in my previous video, that how Wordsworth's relation to nature was different from the other romantic poets like Shelley and Keats, because Wordsworth spiritualized nature. So, as we have been talking about Wordsworth's interest in nature, so surely he was a poet of nature, because in all its forms, nature was important to Wordsworth. And as a child, also, books did not inspire him so much as the natural fields and the elements of nature where he enjoyed most. And so he played truant in his classes. And it was his intimate contact with nature since his childhood that gave him the stimulus as well as inspiration to write about nature in all its forms. And his own growth of mind and spirit is because of his this deep connection, this spiritual bond with elements of nature. Wordsworth also showed his affinity for nature with the famous poem which we remember as I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. So the very lines beautifully bring to our mind these elements of nature. What is this term romanticism which we have been talking about throughout? We need to understand this term as a large term defining the poetry of this era. So, in general, it's a collective term which describes much of the art and literature both produced during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It actually can be seen as a revolution in the arts alongside the political, social, and industrial revolutions of the age. All spheres of human activity were undergoing great change because of French Revolution, which had led the masses to revolt against the torture of the state. William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge both were among the first British poets to explore new theories and ideas that were sweeping through Europe during their time. So their poems, they display many characteristics of romanticism which we are going to just understand more clearly. And during this period there was a shift of emphasis in the arts away from the structured intellectual reasoned approach of the 18th century, and therefore this 18th century is known as Age of Reason or Enlightenment, because the focus was mainly on logical thinking towards ways of looking at the world which recognize the importance of emotions and imagination. So, some of the general broad characteristics of Romanticism in art are that, as I've just mentioned, it covered the period from 1790 to 1850 broadly. And basically, Romanticism in art is a reaction against the neoclassical and rationalistic ideals and the realization of the emotional and imaginative aspects of life. This also expresses a delight in simplicity of theme, feeling, and expression. And as I've just mentioned, that romantic art worships nature and lives and thoughts of humble men and women rather than the court people are made a focus of the material of art during this time. And at the same time, fascination with supernatural, as in Coleridge's rhyme of the ancient man era. The World is Too Much with Us by Wordsworth is a sonnet, and in it, Wordsworth criticizes the world of the first industrial revolution because it was a time when humanity started being absorbed too much in materialism and distancing themselves from nature. The poem was composed in 1802 and was first published in Poems in two volumes, the anthology called Poems, in 1807. So, like most Italian sonnets, it's basically the structure is of 14 lines written in iambic pentameter. And this sonnet reflects Wordsworth's view that humanity must get in touch with nature to progress spiritually. So, Wordsworth, as I had mentioned in my previous video, that his connection with nature, unlike the other romantic poets, Shelley and Keats, was that he spiritualizes nature, and so his focus was on the this element of nature. Coming to the rhyme scheme of this poem, it is that the first eight lines a rhyme A B B A B B A, and the last six as C D C D, and this is basically a Italian or Petrarchan form of sonnet because it uses the last six lines called sestet to answer the proposition or the problem raised in the first eight lines, which is termed as octave. So the problem is set in the octave, and the sestet raises or concludes with the solution. So, some more important facts regarding the form of the poem. As I have just said, that Wordsworth has employed in this poem a strictly structured form, that is the Italian sonnet, and which conforms to a set of strict conventions. A sonnet, as students you all must know, is a poem of 14 lines, and this small poem is this form is suited to the expression of a single idea or sentiment, since it is an impression of unity and completeness. So, as in many sonnets by the Romantic poets, Wordsworth creates a tension between the emotional, natural, and fluid themes explored in the poem and the structured form of the sonnet. So, this tension between the form and the content reflects what was occurring during the Romantic era itself, in which artists and poets were rebelling in the structured world of the neoclassical period. So, Wordsworth employed the familiar with the new and revolutionized it, and he uses the structure of the sonnet as well as refers to the familiar ancient gods to persuade the reader to engage in a positive way to the concepts which he addresses.